This feels like a dangerous video to make. Discussing art shouldn't ignite a fear of having my therapy room raided and set on fire by a mob. It's pretty sad to see the chatter about a film resembling sports teams rallying through a rough seasonal end, since the internet managed to make discussing about the average visionary directed blockbuster feel like stepping into some festering war zone. But I guess this comes with passion at this point, so I'll risk stepping on a mine putting in my 2 cents about this because I kinda like space operas. I also like aspects of Zack Snyder's body of work, and I take that Rebel Moon is meant to be some sort of altered, repackaged take on that classic IP known as the archetypal mainstream idea of said genre, which will inevitably result in some obvious conventional commonalities, which is fine. I don't think similitude in of itself is a problem. Everything is a copy of a copy times infinity, and it's known that the best artists are good at concealing their influences by stealing from many sources, birthing new ideas through their unique perspectives. Rebel Moon shouldn't be punished for occasionally glancing at Star Wars' desk. We should treat movie making less like math exams and more like a collective art lab where peeking into each other's work for inspiration is encouraged, to a degree. It'll all come down to execution and presentation to better justify the familiar elements shown again with its new coat of paint. To say that there are only a few stories to be told through the handling of Star Destroyers, laser swords, bounty hunters, and alien bars would be a bit closed-minded. There's fun in seeing the variety of aesthetic alterations those elements can undergo. With all that said, I see getting to direct an original space opera as a sci-fi fantasy director's ultimate goal, a privilege Snyder was honored with, though I should admit that my enthusiasm for such a thing would have been much higher, say, a decade ago using the look of Watchmen or Sucker Punch as a visual preview instead of Army of the Dead. Even if I'm not into it, I've got no choice but to come to terms with Snyder's career and aesthetic decisions. Regardless, the least he could do was to take this opportunity to use familiar space operatic elements to hopefully say something different, showcasing the genre's versatility in the process, a task which seems as fun as it would be daunting. I have a funny feeling that I should start with some positives to show that I am fair and good. If Snyder is a hack, at least he's a talented one, so his movies are bound to have some nugget of creativity in them, such as this neat little transition, sadly ruined via marketing. Nonetheless, it's the type of good editing efficiency I like to see in montage storytelling. The film's also surprisingly not as much of an eyesore as advertised, for the most part. YouTube's compression system really isn't doing Netflix any justice, not helped by the film's chosen palette. For some reason, the scene where the soldiers were setting camp in the village stood out from the rest. I like how the armor's detail is elevated by the light bouncing off it, providing the shot with its needed texture despite the shallow focal length. All things making this scene fun to screenshot through despite the color grading being evocative of a sore throat. You know exactly what I mean. The same way that Russo brother directed movies are the visual equivalent to hard concrete. When it comes to the rest, if the movie were a person, I'd ask for someone's permission to perform CPR because it looks ghastly. Give it a blood transfusion, defibrillate it, crack a celery on top of it, revive it. Dorothy didn't make that trip to Oz for nothing. It's kind of a waste to have a planet covering most of a frame and not to exploit the potential vibrance that could have come from that idea. Do I need to bring up Jupiter Ascending as an example? No, but I'll do it anyways because we could use the refreshment. And I'll use any pretext to remind people what peak space opera should look like. It's not even a tonal issue because Snyder and Larry were onto that back in 2011. Just do a Sucker Punch again. I can almost envision Larry Fong trying to persuade, even begging Snyder to rely on color for mood and atmosphere because Vibrance left as soon as Larry did and I miss them both very much. It's not with color, bring contrast through darker shades, but I guess this wouldn't be as much a problem if the photography was just generally better on all fronts, with aspects of the mise-en-scène better complemented by it. All that aside, I thought this scene looked fine at best, even if infuriating to watch for not mastering the art of writing detestable characters. Movies like Inglourious Basterds and Pan's Labyrinth show that there's an avenue to write those in a compelling way that doesn't come off as forced to the point of not making sense. Not a skill possessed by whoever wrote this. I won't find any pleasure in unpacking this messy scene. You see, those landed soldiers need to get those cargo boxes into some hut, and from one of those boxes emerges a surprisingly well-rendered drone voiced by Sir Hopkins, and this cracked-out little Nazi, amazed by those still being commissioned, wants to show how their programming prevents them from fighting back, so for that, he shoots the drone while a soldier hands it a box, and the drone falls, and the Nazi bullies the drone, shooting him repeatedly as if it wasn't his own resources onto which he was wasting ammunition. So this nice guy soldier named Aris, it doesn't matter, interrupts Marcus's reckless release, prompting him to say, "What if I shoot you instead?" And the good guy, being a fearless fool, is like, "Aight, bet," which I kinda respect. Wish the movie did more of him and not have him hidden by character number 5 in the last we see of him. But back to the scene. So the sergeant, Faunus, who, by the way, spends most of the movie wearing an expression conveying a combination of confusion and intense dehydration, intervenes, breaks the altercation off, and tells the private to get those crates inside the house in a way which came off as if he wasn't already doing that until this idiot needed a point to be proven, interrupting the team from performing said task, putting them in danger in the process. I get it. This scene serves as world building, a showcase of the dehumanization of robots, and for said drone to be exposed to humanity's worst aspects, assuming its relevance in part 2. I just think it could have been better staged, and it's concluded by the sergeant telling K2SO to go wash himself as if being covered in dirt would be some sort of hindrance. If anything, telling it to keep doing its job while still covered in thick mud would further press on it being treated as a labor tool rather than a soldier, a person. That's what I mean by confused and messy, an issue which sadly permeates the entire film. By this point, I'm hoping that this ship can be saved by either its characters or the interesting ideas they'll carry. There's definitely an attempt at a statement through Korra's disengagement from intimacy and social gatherings. There's an opportunity to maybe explore the psychological repercussions a fascist system can have on someone even long after having escaped it. To put it shortly, Korra can't feel at home, unable to connect with what is supposedly meant to be a safe haven. Sounds interesting. Seems like something you'd want to show through behavioral displays made relevant by the plot and not eagerly boxed into a monologue delivered by a character we don't care for and sadly never do. Her interactions are never affected by her disposition, at least not meaningfully. The layered depths of a character won't matter if they aren't going to be unpeeled in a compelling way with no room left for intrigue or mystery. Instead, she just comes off as a student who's pretending to act nervous while the teacher is talking about the sea so everyone thinks she's a mermaid. All the fun, endearment, and sympathy that could have came in getting to know her is taken away by this monologue comprising of edgy, boring lines given to this guy who I just know is already aware of all that baggage, making this come off as info only being repeated for the audience instead of just two characters having a moment. He even looks like he's dissociating, having heard countless variations of the same trauma dump. A good sign of a filmmaker's interest in humanizing his characters is seeing the same amount of care he puts into the action in the scenes where two characters are given a space to creatively showcase their chemistry, however defined. This, amongst many other scenes, signaled to me that we're dealing with a writer who doesn't have much of an interest in having his characters open up to each other naturally, progressively, mysteriously between set pieces, and would just rather get all the character bio out of the way before barely making it to the 10-minute mark, with an accompanying score begging you to feel something in order to quickly move on to the action, which isn't even that impressive in retrospect. It just came off as if Snyder put action above all else, and while that's normally his forte, being presented with the worst action he's ever directed is probably the most subversive thing this movie had to offer. Even if a bit unfair to use Watchmen's high bar for comparison, the action is the one thing you know is likely to deliver. The thing about the fights in Watchmen is that the impeccable choreography displays all the speed and weight needed, removing the necessity to compensate with camera movements, leaving a surprising number of static shots aside of some slow pans to savor the moves, also adding a romantic touch to the chaos with slow motion sparingly used for added emphasis. We loved it in 300 for how it created mythological frescoes, literally moving paintings, or in Watchmen for emulating the stillness and impact of comic book panels. I guess we also loved it in Sucker Punch for an amalgamation of those reasons. It got to a point where Snyder and that cinematographer he used to be besties with almost made it look easy. Those shots were staged in a way for them to only work via bullet time, looking weird otherwise, a testament to their conception and to great effect. Unlike in Rebel Moon, where its excessive usage seems borderline accidental for its lack of apparent justification. Slow motion as a whole doesn't deserve to be condemned for Rebel Moon because let's not omit the insane number of shots made iconic thanks to it, with Watchmen and 300 being major culprits. The issue is the purpose and execution, not the tool itself. I find it ironic how Zack Snyder's earlier work would exude this level of maturity you'd only see from filmmakers having acquired the years of experience he now possesses, making it sadder to witness aspects of his signature now coming off as boyish and ordinary in what I can only describe as this bizarre regression consisting of active artistic choices. Was I wrong for simply wanting to see some of that 300 to Sucker Punch energy reincorporated more than a decade later in what should theoretically be Snyder's biggest film yet? Imagine being told that the guy who was responsible for this shot would one day get to make a space opera only for it to look like the Asylum's Star Wars, only with an unusual budget. By the time the climactic battle was happening, I couldn't believe the lack of thought in what I can only refer to as expensive play fight. Everyone's just ducking, shooting, screaming, or doing their personal stick, separated from one another, isolated in their own subsection of the set, with lasers flying left and right, less to hit a target and more to distract you from how monotonous the action is. Like footage from a badly coordinated LARP event. Worst shown through Ray Fisher just swinging his bat through hordes of gun-blazing soldiers and somehow making it to the ladder.
Oh my god, he just ran in.
It's the worst RPG combat strategy you'll ever see. He dies.
God damn it, Leroy.
Good run though, all things considered. This is all made even worse due to the set pieces, whether it's a boss fight or a hippogriff flight, serving as connective tissue between those attempts at character development. The film introduces you with a new face every 5 minutes, some of them with their own individualized quest to accomplish before joining the brigade, which sounds like a fun structure if charmingly handled, but the film's running time just ends up condensing all those moments, robbing them of their dramatic potential. How can you impress on how difficult it is to ride the lion bird if not by showing the guy, Tarak, trying and eating dirt several times before finally succeeding? Instead, he just approaches the thing, sweet talks to it in Na'vi, passes the vibe check, rides it, and takes his freedom. Freedom here being the recurring motif. You have the worker finding his freedom through a challenge, the assassin saving a kidnapped daughter from an alien arachnid, you have the rogue warrior finding hers through retaliation, and yet all of their exploits are made weightless, seeming easy, lacking the sort of build-up from witnessing how daunting they are because of that constraining running time. And no, I am not asking for a 4-hour cut. God no. Please don't. I doubt that a doubled running time would change the fact that Korra is basically invulnerable. She just kinda decides whether or not she should intervene, until she does. Conan the Barbarian accepts a bet, wins. Queen Duna pulls up and is like, yeah, I'll reach, but there's this spider in my living room I gotta kill real quick. It's Jenna Malone. She kills her and scooches in. Jamon's practically just chilling with nothing else to do, so they drag him in, which is also an exaggeration because he didn't need that much convincing either.
Leave me alone. Leave me.
Revenge.
Though in all fairness, he was drunk. Would have been really funny if the film had him reconsidering it halfway on board due to sobering up, only to realize that he's stuck on the ride. But I guess being funny isn't part of Snyder's written aesthetic. A director with a sense of humor could have dug up a gag about how all of the side characters are busy in their own more interesting movies, only to be dragged out of their solo entries by Sophia. Maybe poke fun at the repetitive structure by having each of the characters say a variation of the same line when joining the group, with a similar shot motif to add to the humor. But all that would require self-awareness, a concept I don't think Snyder has ever heard of. This is definitely where I can be told to go back to watching my Marvel junk, because a sense of humor and self-consciousness are definitely not traits held by the most accomplished directors, but I guess I should expect to be told so by people who have a very narrow media diet. Mind you that Gone Girl is a very funny film. Self-awareness, when done right, can turn constraints into strengths. It's also a gateway to creativity, something the film also lacks beyond the mere presence of a few concepts. I feel that taking itself so seriously prevented the movie from being as bold as it could have been, all while preserving its precious seriousness when appropriate. An alien spider robbing mothers of their children in a city built over its native habitat is a lot to unpack, and probably deserves to have its thematic layers unpeeled and explored, but sadly, the movie doesn't belong to it, ultimately also condemning it to the monologue treatment. But I think there was a missed opportunity to add a bunch of children-sized cocoons onto the quote-unquote webbing to imply a higher number of victims, emphasizing how much of a city-scale problem she is. Perhaps a little too dark and unsubtle for Snyder. You'd be one step from naming the spider Amber, you know, because of the missing kids. Missed opportunity is a running theme. Something could have been said or done with all those concepts in a way which could have cemented some level of iconic status, but time for development or some thoughtful deconstruction was never given, to which I'd suggest maybe just don't. Put them on the back burner, freeze them and save them up for later. Another movie, another thing, especially considering how Netflix has been leaving the playground for Snyder to do whatever he wants. Hell, save those for a 4th season of Love, Death and Robots. Anything to do those concepts justice instead of carelessly throwing them in a blender. I get that showcasing sci-fi concepts in this relentless manner can communicate how bizarre a world is for being so casually displayed, but it's more likely to feel like a waste, only making me want to watch superior versions of whatever is on screen. All the scenes with the Binu did was reminding me that I was due to revisit the Alfonso-directed Harry Potter film. The music can blare all at once. I won't be coerced into feeling anything watching some Chad tenderly rub beaks with the bird. I just couldn't care for it on a level deeper than its surprisingly well-rendered feathers, and I'm not going to expect this issue to be fixed by some elusive director's cut. I think this habit of expecting something that doesn't even exist to fix a thing should be thrown into the sun. As unpleasant as it sounds, we need to live in the present, not in some ideal theoretical future. Not all of us are equipped with a domesticated heptapod allowing us to see time as a circle, having visions as blurry as Snyder's dream lens of a potential, more complete cut of a film bloated by an additional hour unlikely to fix it. This is the movie we waited for and the one we were served, so it will be discussed as is. I shouldn't have to wait 3 more months to retroactively care for the bird, or the magical princess, or K2SO, or the fact that Korra and the main antagonist are related, or basically anything the film begs you to care for past the hour mark. It's not an attention span issue, but rather one of disinterest. I paid attention, in case the Gatling screenshotting wasn't a good enough proof. I've got beef with that breed of space opera for throwing new supernatural concepts at you every 5 minutes without any time or interest to develop them or even try to meet their executive potential. Jupiter Ascending, while driving me absolutely insane for it, is a movie I'd still much rather watch for its unique packaging of space operatic conventions and for being so visually distinct. The Star Wars similarities are there, but its aesthetic competence practically bears its influences. That's why Star Wars never even comes to mind while watching this, unless it's wishing that modern Star Wars could have perhaps taken a few lessons from it, but that's a whole other video. Side note, I was supposed to use Jupiter Ascending as coping media in hype for The Force Awakens, and what a strange time that was. Anyways, I hate to see space opera failing repeatedly for this apparent assumption that flashy effects on their own are enough to earn the audience's investment. Not me feeling weird getting to the film's final third, watching the main cast lined up for execution and wondering if I were supposed to care about any of them at this point, let alone remember their names. Perhaps that's a problem the sequel will fix, or that mysterious director's cut people keep invoking. We don't know these people, which I guess is why Snyder, being the skilled writer that he is, pulls this crazy move of having the villain list and describe each and every one of them through, you guessed it, monologue, because show don't tell is definitely not a mantra associated to the status of visionary. They're gonna have to pay me to read a comic man to provide additional context because I've done enough charity for the month. Maybe Snyder should try focusing on a well-rounded enough pair of characters instead of compensating for how empty they all are by making a whole football team. Korra and Gunnar as a pair would have been enough, showing her becoming more comfortable with intimacy and overcoming the psychological and emotional damages caused by her childhood through their shared journey. Explore Sofia Boutella's physical and performative talent, better displayed in Kingsman and Climax. Do a thing. Imagine training so hard to look like your mythical best self, all in service of a walking void. It's all about the looks, and I'd add Korra in the list of fictional characters motivating me to hit the gym, but that aside, everyone just feels like a placeholder. Some of them can just be reduced to just dudes. One of them has an accent because someone can find a better way for him to stand out. Not a single definable archetype in sight, which I think has been an essential component to some of the most successful sci-fi franchises out there. The ex-samurai mentor, the distant traumatized parental figure, the naive but strong-willed protag, the seemingly benign living weapon, the vulnerable but resilient crew member, the no-fun-having project manager. Scoundrel might have been how Guardians of the Galaxy earned its position in pop culture, by enhancing each of the members' quirks, turning them into their own unique archetype, achieving iconography as a result, something the Avengers also thrived on. I hope I'm not being misinterpreted as wanting the MCU formula. Guardians of the Galaxy is just an efficient recent space operatic example. Not to mention it would just be dismissive. I'm not a Marvel shill. Like, brother, you're in space. Exaggerate your personalities if there is any. Star Trek, Firefly, Aliens, Space Dandy, Magnetic Rose. Everything in Rebel Moon feels either derivative of another or downright plain, perfectly exemplified by the Empire analog called The Imperium, no jokes, which reads as if Snyder omitted to give it a few more passes to better define it as its own separate thing after its rejection from Star Wars land, leaving us with something so hollow I didn't know was even allowed prior to being subjected to it. What gives the Imperium's army its distinctiveness as a space-wide antagonistic militia? Not much aside from the soldier tunics managing to have more detail than Imperial officer uniforms and yet still feeling less inspired and somehow cheaper. Someone also thought we forgot about Dune's Artradius wardrobe, tried to do it again and failed, though I definitely wouldn't have noticed Kingdom Hearts' crown symbol clumsily repurposed as a pin if it weren't for my little brother pointing it out, so that's funny. You know what, let's call it an Easter egg. The tunics blending in with the backdrops proves that good cinematography comes down to so much more than just good photography. It's good mise en scène, it's good production design, good wardrobe. An outfit can make or break a shot. Maybe don't have your soldiers wear a color as dim and boring as your background. It's unpleasant to the eye. Dune understood the assignment, though I'll admit the Imperium's uninspired outfits do sort of mirror the hollowness of its motivation. Something something, thousand kings, something treason, something lust for power. Not even Sir Anthony could save this. I don't think anyone could. Maybe the point lies less in the origins of the circumstances and more in the behaviors it encourages, but I'm not convinced. It doesn't even need to make sense as long as it tells a story good enough to distract your audience from the more superficial elements. Otherwise, you've got people on YouTube making 5-hour-long essays shredding your movie to pieces. If anything, the movie dug itself deeper by over-explaining and repeating its uninteresting lore, which feels like something designed by a teenager creating a fantasy sandbox only interested in the epic aesthetic without its necessary foundation. The antagonist's motivation is of course repeated, I'm so sorry, via monologue through Korra, who explains that there were no terms, only the lust for destruction. Armies led by a man, Belisarius, who relished the ecstasy of combat. It's almost symbolic of Snyder's shallow penchant for on-screen destruction, something I think could have been salvaged through metatext. Yes, a bit desperate, but also look at what we're working with, so hear me out. What if Belisarius literally saw warfare as a medium of art, and I don't mean in some symbolic way. I mean, what if he literally used war to create real tangible frescoes of fire and rubble?
Oh, it's beautiful.
Just some quirky psycho dude who's into the sublime spectacle of war and destruction. Kinda like Snyder. Not literally, of course. Snyder seems to be a decent man and merely has a simple fondness for the visual appeal of the artifice of high-budget chaos. Harmless if a bit shallow, but anyways, that's my patch. A fun metaphor for the romanticization of destruction through the gaze of spectacle. A filmmaker's self-inserted analog through the war-hungry tyrant. I think it's a fun, bizarre, and surrealist motivation for Belisarius which could have filled for all the lacking areas. The analogy could have provided the substance, no longer needing to make literal sense, and I think that's fine in theory. Trust in your audience's artistic literacy. I even think the die-hard Snyder fans could have been into that. Even cooler if there was like another Jimmy bot who was maybe tasked with painting giant Renaissance-like recreations of his master's exploits to better drive the point home. Picture this. Every time Belisarius dispatched a nuke, he could show it reflected on the drone's metallic face as he computes the event for him to reproduce later on some wall-sized canvas back at the palace. I'd be interested in seeing this level of introspection from Snyder at this point. Something else which could have saved it from this limbo residing between being Star Wars and not wanting to plagiarize it, devoid of a single molecule of an attempt to satirize, deconstruct, or just comment on the IP it initially wanted to be part of. Hollow is the only word that comes to mind. There isn't even much to say about the film's general aesthetic, mostly stale no matter the setting. If one were to argue that it's meant to communicate the oppressive regime reigning over this universe, I'd remind that there's a way to make a world that could be described as dim and depressing visually poignant through good technique backed up by narrative intent. In Blade Runner 2049, Villeneuve and crew used every tool at their disposal to illustrate Kay's loneliness through the world which surrounds him, the style being the substance. It's also harder to have a distinct vibe if there isn't much to say through it in the first place. Or maybe there is something being said. I mean, how else could I explain the film's bizarrely packaged sexual overtone, whether it's the questionable opening shot, the village leader's mating rally, or unfortunately, the repeated motif of sex assault? If I were to desperately make something up, I'd say that this movie is meant to illustrate the different avenues of virility through differing factions as the farmers do through celebration and community, whereas the Imperium or any antagonist do so through dominance, to put it lightly. But then there's also just simple eroticism. I don't know, Snyder does love his bare-chested men, so this might as well be incidental, further adding to the confusion. If there were no doubt that Snyder meant it for me to make this assessment, I think it also would have been committed in other aspects to better help it beyond this wall of subtext, and I, for one, think subtext is for cowards. The film somehow manages to have those elements feel so repressed, all while wanting them to be there so frickin' bad. There's discomfort in not being sure whether the phallic ship thrusting itself through the vaginal fabric of space is meant to be a bit or a visual extension of fascism's literal lust for violence. I had to say this sentence with a straight face because the movie says it with a straight face. I'm not weird, the movie's weird. It has this echo of a statement regarding the practice of virility, but the aesthetic does nothing to support it. I don't know, let it be spoken through suggestive wardrobe and set design. Get quirky with the vehicles. Throw in some sexy saxophones in the orchestra. Not just for sleaze, but also to call back to film noir, which would have been more appropriate with Larry Fong's expressionist involvement. Remember when he did a film noir in 2009, Zach? I miss it. Maybe have the helmets worn by the Imperium soldiers look like fetish gear. Something Jupiter Sending did just for kicks because the Wachowski sisters are shameless queens. I guess you can't ask for a sleazily produced space opera since this is apparently the censored cut and not the true, raw, unrated Destin Snyder cut, which would surely be the patch to cure this film from its apparent repression. Being trapped somewhere between a PG-13 rating and a hypothetical R rating, the film can't commit to the latter. There's more to an R rating than additional F-bombs, titties, and added blood. It's the subject matter and how it's approached. It's honesty in tackling taboos and actually treating your audience like adults. It's boldness in the foundation, in elements which, if taken out, would ultimately dispose the film of its vital organs. It's bravery above all else. Speaking of which, you'd think that a movie being so sexually vocal and in space could have some room for some respectable queerness somewhere in here, but I guess Netflix in the year of 2023 wasn't the time or place. Oh wait, I take that back. How could I forget the scene where Gunnar gets touched by a grub in that dingy bar? A scenario defended for showcasing that men can also be sex victims, which is fair, but to convey that message once again through the predatory gay trope and have it be the only gay presence in the narrative is not only gauche, but also backwards. It perpetuates a bad idea, reducing gayness to sleazy predation. It could have been forgiven if it wasn't the only technically gay/queer thing the film had to offer, though I guess it wasn't since there was just a need to slip in those drag queens into the same dingy backdrop, doubling down on that negative connotation. You'd think that Snyder would take working under Netflix's more open environment to perhaps make up for his bumpy connection to queer depictions, or maybe even just to show Disney how it's done after years of tiptoeing and beating around the gay bush, but like I said, that would take guts. Sure, here's to spending your whole career romanticizing the male form, and beautifully so. No complaints there, but God forbid you show actual gayness under the slightest of positive glimmer. The signals have never been so mixed. Maybe he's afraid of doing it too well, or worse, that he might enjoy it. I'd enjoy it, as a lot of people would. What's stopping him? This is an original Netflix property. Have a competently written, openly queer supporting character. Coward? Or should I wait for part 2 for some miraculous course correct? There might be an argument for queerness not being necessary, despite queerness in real life revealing itself to be more and more prominent through its gradual normalization, making its absence in fiction somewhat exclusionary. But if so, then the scene where the space ogre grabs Gunnar's crotch while making some intense propositions also wasn't necessary, and I feel like it deserved some kind of respectable gay presence to clear out the air regarding all that. The movie actually daring to be positively queer would actually justify people proposing audiences to go into this with an open mind, as if this movie were some kind of subversive, transgressive, status quo breaking deconstruction of the space opera subgenre. Give me a break. And to have a mind more open than me spawning a thesis about the narrative and aesthetic displays of sexual ownership to make sense of its Freudian imagery would require surgery. It's literally just Zack Snyder's Star Wars, and I find claiming that people don't connect with it due to it being unconventional or inaccessible to be downright insulting. That bar scene sucked, and so did the gunfight that followed it. I guess it's consistent with the rest of the film. Okay, I should maybe cool off and deviate towards the thing for which I feel more sadness than anger in terms of missed potential. Me liking space opera as much as I do doesn't make me a connoisseur of the subgenre, but I can still feel an inkling that romance is kind of an essential component, love being the only thing that transcends time and space and all. So I felt a jolt at the mere presentation of this militia encouraging romantic pairings amongst its soldiers to increase performance in battle. I was compelled by the irony, love on the battlefield, or whatever. Not only is it based on an actual practice, but is also a concept I've rarely seen explored in mainstream cinema, let alone fantasy. This film included. Can someone remind me how or when this system or concept was ever relevant or given the importance I think it deserved? Genuinely asking because I don't think it was. I personally think it should have been the film's main through line, giving it its needed emotionally heavy core. Instead, all we get is a kiss and this one shot of Cora doing CPR on her dying lover, looking mildly distraught instead of conveying a fraction of what I could hardly interpret as grief or anything that would have her permanently divorce herself from the mere idea of attachment. This should have been the moment where her world was flipped upside down. Not a single tear was shed, or maybe you just can't see it because of all the snow. Maybe tears are harder to capture through dream lenses. It's kind of funny how Finn, with his face concealed, managed to convey more emotion for a downed fellow soldier, though, to be fair, credit should be given to the film language making up for the absence of a face, but I digress. So, instead of making me want to rewatch The Force Awakens, those flashbacks did nothing. Here was a chance to go even a mile further and spice up the bit of romance with science fiction. If I were to turn this into a story which could only have its place in the genre, here's what I'd propose. What if the soldiers were put into pairs to be injected with this love serum, which made them fall madly in love with each other, enhancing their combined performance in combat, illustrated in crazy, harmonious choreography, which we know is totally in Snyder's ballpark, but say crank that up to 11 with the choreography almost displaying some kind of psychic connection through synchronicity, like finishing each other's sentence. A variety of couples making one combative entity the moment the serum was given to them, and if you were to get a bit insidious with it, you could invite this moral discourse about the possibility of forcing someone to fall in love with a partner outside of their choosing. What if one of the soldiers, say Cora, was forced into taking the serum, having feelings imposed onto her for someone she perhaps even despised? Maybe the main villain. You've got a potential allegory for toxic relationships, and even a more tactful and subtle way of handling, dissent. And maybe that serum and all which came with it was the first time she ever experienced love in its most volatile essence, solidifying her negative perception of that sort of experience. Maybe in that world, the serum's usage outside of the military was made illegal because of its reported increasing of passion crimes, and I should stop right there because I'm basically barfing out a whole potential episode for Love, Death, and Robots for free for Netflix to take and generate, and I'd rather keep some of this for when I eventually get my much-deserved chance to write and direct my own neat, romance-driven space opera. If anything, this video better reach the stratosphere, so thanks in advance. I'm just saying I saw a good, better handling of themes of intimacy and the fears of feeling it. To see this well done through this genre would have been a moment. Space opera is this pretextual goldmine to have cool costumes, cool spaceships, cool planets, and cool everything to say so much about us through dense cosmic melodrama. That's a good thing, by the way. I think that's how the genre could thrive, and by thrive, I mean be good and appreciated by many, which is a necessity for it to sustain itself. Unless cheaply made to embrace artifice at the aim to achieve some sort of retro charm, good luck crowdfunding one of those. Such a production has to be earned and needs to have its expensive nature made up for by hordes of people clamoring up to those, and sadly, not everyone's that into lasers, aliens, and space battles like you and I, so you'll have to rely on boring things like good writing and melodrama to not only garner that audience, but also for it to deeply connect with it and have their uncles and grandmas talk about it. Spectacle isn't enough no matter how pretty. I don't think it ever was, and people would be wrong to believe that Star Wars would hold its place in film canon if it weren't for the simple yet compelling story it told, and how it went about it. The aesthetic was just the perfect icing for it to better sell. The winning cases always had infectious characters driving some interesting stories, exploring its themes, and not just have them float around through meaningless dialogue. There may have been a time when the promise of unearthly escapism was enough to lure in a crowd, even though this promise seemed to have been met by people who accorded that same importance to the writing, which kept the whole ride afloat. Something I feel is now being disregarded through the assumption that VFX heavy spectacle is enough. See Valerian, see Mortal Engines, see Tomorrowland, see John Carter, the list goes on. The audience isn't likely to strongly click with whatever new world they're given if the conductor has nothing to offer on a human level, whether it's some kind of critique or one's inner truth carried by a good narrative. An attempt would prove that there was something to say through this universe you were allowed to create thanks to infrastructural levels of capital left at your disposal. Here's a chance to expose a large audience to a perspective likely to be dissimilar to one it possesses. Like I said, space opera is a pretext to have awe-inspiring imagery and to present strange concepts in an accessible way, all while unraveling truths about our own reality. The possibilities are endless. Even if what you're saying has already been said, idiosyncrasy will make up for it. It's just frustrating seeing mainstream sci-fi be so devoid of any statement through all of its spectacular expenses. The VFX should be the icing, not the cake itself. Unless you're James Cameron. The public needs to be reminded of what space opera can do, and this just wasn't it. It's more than just visual candy, it's intertextuality, it's a dialogue about cinema carried from a filmmaker to another, undergoing for longer than we're likely aware of. Rebel Moon definitely tries to be human at times, notably in the exchange between Sam and Jimmy, but that scene hardly makes up for everything else. Imagine being given the budget to showcase this monumental amount of destructive simulation physics at multiple occasions without wanting to elaborate on a single original thought whenever they would muster. Say something and develop your themes instead of creating this illusion of depth through dreary tones and weighty repeated buzzwords. The word honor lost its meaning after the 10th time it was uttered. There's something fun in the irony of being set so far from Earth while being so thematically grounded, and I don't think this film really successfully tapped into that. The plot could have explained that Cora's apprehension for intimacy isn't out of disinterest, but out of fear of potentially suffering through that loss again. And to instead double down on this assault, which definitely had its presence in fascist occupations, just comes off as an oddly specific thing to portray in your film instead of deep and researched, especially considering an observable pattern in Snyder's work. Someone tell him that there are other ways to showcase the depravity in fascism's exertion of power. And I'm still not convinced that my sleazy reading of the film is me getting the point. I think that was all me. I did all the work, and I want all the credit for giving the space portal Tussie a non-humorous justification because I don't think that showing genitalia qualifies as the height of comedy. I'll be safe and assume that it would be beneath Snyder's visual prose, or is it? Making this video, I was worried to have too much to say for not exactly coming at this from a focused angle, but then again, what is there to say? I've already seen this movie hundreds of times, only better shot, better directed, better scored, better designed, just better elsewhere, and what a shame it is that despite being given carte blanche, it still wants to be Star Wars so bad. Made even sadder knowing that getting to make a space opera isn't just handed to you, and we're potentially seeing this chance being wasted twice, inducing that same moderate grief I became familiar with from the lesser entries in that subgenre. Being a response to Star Wars and repurposing its familiar assets didn't bother me at first until it sank in me that Snyder was literally allowed to do anything else but instead still wanted to make Star Wars at home. In a sad attempt at trying to be everything but itself, it ultimately ended up being nothing. If this sounds cruel, know that I wrote this thing actively toning down my more fervent feelings towards the film out of constructivism. So if you'd be interested in consuming something closer to how I really feel about Rebel Moon, I'd happily invite you to read Drew Magary's review of it, which I'll link down below. It's as well written as it is brutally funny through its colloquial language. It just gets better and better as it goes on. No, I don't think it's the worst movie ever made, but reading it to a coworker who also saw the film was nothing but cathartic. Good read. You're not gonna regret it, unless Rebel Moon is like your favorite movie, perhaps further reason to read it. I'm not this harsh on Rebel Moon out of some tribal preemptive disdain, but out of sincere frustration in seeing its apparent refusal to exploit its own potential. While there's an argument for enjoying a film for what it is, considering space opera's endless possibilities, I feel that it should also be criticized for what it doesn't do, for not going as far or as deep as it could have gone into its own captivating cosmic strangeness, while of course preserving some level of humanity at the core. I think science fiction fails to some degree when it doesn't commit to its premise's potential, but honestly, I think that's criticism that can also be applied to any film. Don't just present the concept, explore it through the plot. Break it down, give your thesis statement its required body paragraphs. Actually explore the thing that you're about. Movies are basically film form essays about life. I'm sorry, but it's true. That's what makes them so much fun. That's how they get to be understood or have meanings projected onto them, and have interesting readings made of them, and interpret giant bone ships floating through Freudian wormholes as some genuine statement. I think that's what space opera, or any film, is about. Commit to what you are and you'll stand out for it. Whether for better or for worse, it'll be memorable regardless. What I'm saying is, I tried guys, and Snyder did not. Look, unlike Drew, I'm not here to rightfully drag the movie for entertainment, as fun as that would have been. I just want better movies, and I hope that I made clear the reasons why this movie kinda struck a nerve. So to avoid ending on a bummer note, I'll say that if part 2 miraculously makes up for everything I just said, then I think we'll all be winners in April, even if it looks like kinda more of the same. I'd rather have my assumptions be proven wrong instead of having them be validated by another grueling 2-hour experience. I'm just trying to have a good time, as we all are. Okay, bye.